Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, Contemporary Asian Art from Local to Global. My name is Teresa Caputo. I am the program manager here at the Appraisers Association. As we give everyone some time to log on, I'd just like to mention a few of our upcoming programs. We are very excited to be holding Art Law Day virtually on Friday, November 12th, and the conference also virtual on Monday, November 15th and 16th. More information can be found on our website for those. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. All attendees will be muted for the presentation. We will leave time for a Q&A at the end, so please enter your questions into the Q&A box, and that's the Q&A box, not the chat box. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Ingrid Dudek. Ingrid is a fine art appraiser and art advisor based in New York. She has over 20 years experience with Asian and Western modern and contemporary art, beginning with her time as manager of the groundbreaking contemporary art gallery, the Courtyard Gallery in Beijing in 2000. Ingrid has spent over a decade working in major auction houses, which includes 9 years at Christie's as vice president and senior specialist of Asian 20th century and contemporary art, as well as 2 years at Bonhams as a director of contemporary art. She has a BA from the University of California at Berkeley in the history of art, a master's degree from New York University in cultural anthropology, and was a Fulbright Scholar to China 1999 to 2000. And she is also a certified member of the Appraisers Association. Ingrid, thank you so much, and I am going to pass it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, please go ahead and start the slideshow anytime. Thanks. And yeah, hi, I'm Ingrid Dudek, dialing in from New York, from Brooklyn. A little bummed I can't see anybody, although it's probably for the best. I know I have some friends and former colleagues here, and wish I could see you guys and your pets. So yeah, thank you so much, Teresa, and to the AAA, as I call you, for this opportunity and just for all of your support. It's just been like a real gift to be a member of the association. So let's get started. Maybe next slide. I should say maybe at the outset that with a dozen or so years in the auction houses, it really affected my brain, and then I often by default still speak as a kind of an auction person, and so you'll probably be hearing examples of that today. I always find it helpful to historicize things. It's just sort of like a fun way to like start a conversation maybe sometimes. So I just looked at, just for kicks, I looked at most expensive works of art at the end of the 20th century. I'm not going to go through these in depth. I think the things that are kind of interesting to note is everyone here is a white male. Almost everyone here is European, the exception being George Bellows, American painter, and his painting Polo Crowd, which was, fun fact, bought by Bill Gates at that time. And also maybe worth noting the sales locations, New York, New York, New York, and a little bit of London. And really primarily Impressionist and early modern works. Next slide. So suffice it to say, that was a different world. I just like to use this image whenever I can. It's a board game from maybe the 80s with its own kind of satirical view of what the auction world looked like. Next slide. And then to make kind of a leap forward, let's compare that just briefly with most expensive works sold at auction in 2020, understanding that 2020 was a pretty weird year. And in this case, they didn't all fit on one slide, but we have 3 works by Asian artists who made the top 10. Interestingly, 2 of them kind of ancient, Wu Bin's #2, 17th century ink painting. And the 13th, 14th century ink painting #5 from Renren Fa. And also early or kind of mid-century modernist oil on canvas from the Chinese painter San Yu, sometimes called Chang Yu. And the others on this list have mostly shifted, to, let's say, the second half of the 20th century in terms of who made them and when. And also what's shifted is, like, we still see New York, but Hong Kong also appears on this list a couple times, Beijing as well. Next slide. And just for completion, and then, as a kind of footnote to that strange year we all lived through, these kind of hybrid sales of live streamed global relay races between major sale rooms, Hong Kong, London, Paris, New York. And again, late 20th century or even, moderately recent paintings. Next slide, please. Yeah, and just to get a sense of like what that looks like, these are the 3 of those top 10, the Asian ones. Wu Bin, 10 Views of a Lingbi Rock is in the upper left. Renren Fa, 5 Inebriated Princes Riding Home. And San Yu's 4 Nudes from the 1950s. Next slide, please. And at the end of the day, I'm really kind of more of a qualitative than a quantitative person. So this is the last sort of statistic data dump you'll be enjoying from me. More of a pictures person. So, but again, just as a way of kind of framing the conversation and kind of thinking about what's shifting and where we are today, this is another kind of data crunch of top contemporary artists at auction, the first 20 years of the 21st century. And in this case, these are kind of funny statistics because it's really a volume. It's sort of like a top price plus a volume game. It tells you something, it doesn't tell you everything. And again, we have in this case 6 Asian artists, Zheng Chuanzhi, Zhang Xiaogang, Yoshitomo Nara in the top 10. Before we change slides, it's interesting maybe to note this continual shift into the contemporary, the kind of overwhelming majority of these artists are born in the 50s and 60s. Next slide, please. And then, oh, I'm sorry, I got the number wrong. 7 of the top 20, Chen Yifei, Chinese, Zhou Chunya, Chinese, Takashi Murakami, Japanese, of course, Liu Ye is also Chinese. And just as a side note, Chen Yifei, I mean, we won't probably go into it today. Chen Yifei is such an interesting phenomenon because by birth and death dates, he's a contemporary artist, although he was also working in like a not very contemporary mode as a kind of sentimental realist painter, but like wildly popular in China. Next slide, please. So, question is, how did all this happen? When, where, and why, and who's buying what, and where, and why? And I'm going to take us back to March 30th, 2006. This is not an Ankawara painting. This is my own slide. Next slide, please. On that date, Sotheby's in New York. Is that right? Yes, March 30th. Held Chinese, I think it's called the Asian Contemporary Art Sale in New York. And New Yorkers being New Yorkers, it was news all of a sudden, almost a scandal in some minds, that at that sale, in a sale room full of collectors that people had never heard of and artists whose names people couldn't pronounce, and a Zhang Xiaogong sold for almost $1 million. And this kind of initiated what felt like a media, I'll say frenzy, because I sat in that world, in the auction world, especially at that time, that was suddenly paying attention to a corner of the art world that had been like developing, collected, exhibited, in circulation for quite a long time. But there's something about it happening in New York's very own backyard that all of a sudden it got the art world's attention in a different way. Next slide, please. And for a period of time, I felt Chinese contemporary art in particular, which is where I have the deepest background, made kind of like an unfortunate punching bag, I think, for changes that were happening in the art world and had been happening for a long time, which is to say there was like a shift away from traditional centers of power in terms of spending power, in terms of institutional and intellectual validation, curatorial validation, and also the scale on which value as expressed as a number, because it's not the only form of value, but value expressed as price paid, started to have quite a lot of impact on what we would maybe traditionally call connoisseurship, and that these kind of areas, institutional, art historical, critical, and who buys what, like all that was kind of up for grabs, and nobody really held power kind of quite in the same traditional way. This was like kind of upsetting, I think, for some people. I'm a bit neutral on it, just as an observer. Like, life is changing, and it does change the way art is viewed and appreciated and made. And that's as we say, that's life on life's terms. But it was, it was kind of a thing about who are these guys? Who is this guy, Liu Wei, in the upper left, who that's a self-portrait of him on the toilet, or Yu Mingjun, that's a self-portrait of Yu Mingjun as the Pope, having forgotten to put his pants on. That's a self-portrait of Zheng Fenzhi. I don't know how these all got to be self-portraits. Kind of almost wearing like his childhood clothes, because that red sash is a reference to like being a member of the Red Guard under the Communist Party, surrounded by desiccated watermelons. Then on the lower left, you have Zhang Xiaogang and his sort of conceptual family portraits, which were, often kind of buck-toothed, cross-eyed figures. And Fan Ligjun on the lower right, his sometimes self-portraits-ish, shaved-headed hooligans who just kind of hang out. And they always remind me, I always say they remind me of Marlon Brando in The Wild, is it The Wild Bunch, where they say, "What are you rebelling against?" And he says, "What do you got?" It's that kind of attitude. And also related to these shifts that were happening in the art world was also information flows. The advent of the internet, which we all live on now, where prices and information were no longer kind of like held as esoteric knowledge, were also all very much available. Next slide. So, contemporary art sort of arrived on the shores of New York and London's, I'll say, auction worlds, auction floor room. But what was really going on, just to go like a little bit bigger picture, was that in Asia, especially in the major auction houses in Hong Kong, Sotheby's and Christie's, I give them a lot of credit for this. There was an interest in expanding the category of Asian modern and contemporary art. And I think one thing to understand is that it feels pretty safe to say that there is no Metropolitan Museum of Art in Asia. There is no National Gallery. There is no major institution that's been there forever that has put its like stamp of approval on national culture. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But it doesn't, and it didn't exist, not really. And so I do give the auction houses quite a bit of credit for digging into this field where it was kind of like, hey, there's like 120 years here of ethnically Asian artists engaging modernity. And at that time, the West was modern, so really engaging Western, what were then contemporary art practices, and trying to find a way forward with their own culture. And this is kind of literal. China in particular was in like a kind of a cultural crisis at the start of the 20th century. The imperial system had fallen apart. They were under a republic. They were kind of like, whoa, like we're not, China literally means the Middle Kingdom. Like they're like, we're not the center of the universe, and there's all this other stuff happening out there. So intellectuals, literati, elites were going to the West to study poetry, to study medicine, to study literature, and to study painting. And with the idea of like, how do we take these tools, these philosophies, and make them our own? And San Yu was one of like the first figures in that movement, who went to Paris, being the center of the art world at that time. Very, like, he kind of struggled. I think he was part of like a wealthy silk manufacturing family. So he's like, he's like this literary, he's sort of like a trust fund millennial in Paris in the 20s who, the money was kind of irregular because like global economy and various wars disrupted it more than once. And he connected with, I always reverse his name, I want to say Henri Pierre Rothay, who was also credited with discovering Duchamp, Brancusi, a few others, I can't name them at this time. So there's also this sense that like, this is an artist who was kind of validated by his peers as being interesting and good and contributing something. And so anyway, so like the auction houses were really looking at this, investing in it. And maybe I make it sound really noble. Obviously there was money involved, there was financial incentive, but you really had to like dig these fragile, sometimes uncared for paintings out of a basement. And $600,000 in 2006 is nothing to sneeze at any day of the week, including today, of course. And then, then what happens less than 15 years later? This is an artist who's now recognized as this kind of godfather figure in Chinese modern art and is among the top 10 pieces sold in a given year. Next slide, please. And just to sort of fill out the picture, this, I think fundamentally because China's scale, because of the financial, for the economic reasons, the focus is often on China. And so they continue just to fill this out a little bit, like this sort of subsequent generation was somebody like Wu Dayu, who not only went to Paris, but he came home. And in 1928 founded what is still today one of the most prominent art academies in China. And you can kind of see here, you can track how that how kind of a growing appreciation for his role in not only bringing that training back to China and developing it institutionally, but he also, like San Yu, he also had kind of a theory of like space, shape, movement that he considered to come out of traditional Chinese painting that he was trying to execute in oil. A kind of interesting footnote to him is the works are often really fragile, and often of this scale, rarely larger than this, because he suffered quite a bit for being, this Western leaning modernizer during the Cultural Revolution. So his paintings were the size of something he could easily hide, basically. So they were always a smaller scale. Next slide, please. And, so the really key thing about that is now you have an institution in China that is training people in Western modes of production of art making. And he trained people like Judah Chun, who of course went to Paris and had a career and a CV and an exhibition and collecting list as long as, both my arms. And, similarly trying to engage Western abstraction, but with like a Chinese lyricism and a philosophy. Next slide, please. Another artist who was trained first in Shanghai and Hangzhou under this new education system, and then went to Paris, was of course Zhao Qi. And Zhao Qi is really like the national hero in a way. I think there's sort of a famous quote of a Chinese critic who said Zhao Qi's the artist we've been waiting 100 years for. So like the scale on which these artists are kind of beloved. And he's kind of a great example. Next slide, please, actually. He's kind of, I'm just sort of throwing this in to demonstrate where his market has gone. I'll also add, sometimes I do think the Asian auction houses cheat by making a record price, but they're also selling like the biggest possible thing they can find, which is this 400-inch painting, which, maybe you can see here, he's in a long dialogue with Monet's Water Lilies at this point in his career. Next slide, please. But the point that I kind of wanted to make about Zhao Qi is that, again, here's an artist who received validation kind of on Western terms in his lifetime. When Sam Coots, the dealer in New York who first coined the term abstract expressionism, started using the term and having shows with Jackson Pollock and others in the 1950s, Zhao Qi was one of them. And so he was kind of considered like a big deal, and his work was considered, interesting and relevant to this post-war abstractionist phenomenon that was happening in the US and Europe. He's also kind of like been a great figure, how to say this, because his connection to Chinese culture, I think, is really concrete in his works. Sorry, it's got a weird prompt on my computer. Interestingly, in his earliest years, he wasn't that interested in his own kind of heritage until he saw the works of Paul Klee. And Paul Klee himself had been inspired by ancient forms of Chinese calligraphy in like his hatchwork kind of style of mark making. And so you can kind of see that phase in Zhao Qi's earliest works, but it ended up being this kind of back door into like re-interrogating his own legacy. So then by like the early to mid 50s, like the work on the right, he's exploring mark making that's related to Chinese oracle bones, which are like Shang Dynasty. I don't know my dynasties, let's say really old, but considered like the earliest form of writing, and so like that kind of mark making is no longer descriptive. It's more like he's trying to he's trying to use oil paint like ink more and more. Next slide, please. then, then he has what is sometimes called his hurricane period in the 60s. Next slide, please. In the 70s, it becomes a little bit more oxygen. And throughout all these works, you can see this kind of dialectic between like Western abstraction, but also like a relationship to space and mark making and composition that is explicitly drawn from Chinese aesthetic philosophies and certain periods of Chinese ink painting. Sometimes they say like a landscape painting or a hanging scroll in Chinese is a bit like a double helix, like you're looking both, you can look down into it and up through it. And you can kind of get that in some of Zhao Qi's paintings as well. Next slide, please. So that, I say all that as a kind of backdrop to like what was actually happening. So as a matter of perception, like all these kind of wacky looking guys were showing up in the news and in auction catalogs. And they were part of this kind of larger, market-driven reevaluation of Asia and China's place in global art history. So for this generation in particular, we're looking at some of the key figures of China's contemporary art painting that emerged primarily in I'll say the early 90s. China, everyone's relationship with like Western and cultural imperialism is so different in China, so it doesn't quite map onto our own sort of like post-war modernism and then postmodernism or whatever, because you have these sort of gaps and leaps in history, and you have like sort of a blackout of cultural production during communism, where everything was controlled by the state, and then this like loosening up. Obviously, communism's not over. I sort of mean high communism with the passing of Chairman Mao, and a kind of like period of hope, really, in the 80s. Mao died in 76. I think the first liberalization started to take place in like 79. And the education system was such a mess that like you had this new generation show up, and they were kind of like we don't even know what to do with all this information. Like here you go. Like famously, like Chiang Kai-ge and Zhang Yimou showed up at the Beijing Film Academy, and it was just like, here's the French New Wave. Here's Ingmar Bergman. Like, do with it what you will. Like, it was like this sort of like raw material, and it was the same way in the fine arts academies, just suddenly being exposed to like all these Western forms that they hadn't had access to before. So you see a lot of influence of like pop art. You see a lot of influence of German expressionism. There's a kind of way in which like Weimar Germany mapped, and like the kind of alienation of that period maps onto Chinese experience at that time. But it's kind of hodgepodge, like in terms of who connects with what. I think the dominating force was that optimism was squashed, of course, in the Tiananmen Square tragedy of June 4th, 1989, and was so rapidly replaced with a consumer culture that it was just repugnant to the artists. It was kind of like so much for human rights, but you get to buy things, so that's okay too. So you have like everyone here but Zhang Xiaogang in the lower left, you would on some level call a cynical realist, which was this fantastic name of this art movement that emerged in China in the early 90s, because they were just like appalled by what was happening. So sometimes there's an interest in like psychology and kind of existential drift, which you get maybe in Zheng Fengzhi in the upper right, or Fang Lijun in a different way. He was kind of more iconoclastic. Min Jun, also very iconoclastic, because he was kind of like, we just replaced one ideology for another, and like the masses just follow. You also get this kind of like gray sense of humor, like there's like a heavy irony, but it's very metaphorical, it's very elusive. Liu Wei in the upper left, it's like he's kind of a fantastic painter. I like him, who's kind of interested in like, like Freud in a way, or just like, bodies are gross and life is messy, and like that, like he really likes to get into like the texture of that in so many ways, sometimes literally in his subject matter, sometimes later just as a matter of like abstraction and how he handles paint. And you also have like a real interest in like historical trauma as a metaphor, the kind of both like individual trauma and historical trauma for somebody like Zhang Xiaogang on the lower left, who on one hand, he had severe mental illness in his family, so that always weighed on him really heavily. And then he also felt his generation was just like burdened with so much trauma, and that it was just like acting its way out through the generations in ways that were like uncontrollable. So the point, next slide please, is that like as jarring as this may have been, as with San Yu and Zhao Qi, so with those guys, like they're what's the word? They're kind of bona fides, curatorially, institutionally, were significant. I mean, this is just like a little snapshot of what was going on globally, or at least I'll just say outside of China, in terms of major institutions that were taking kind of an interest in what was going on, including a sort of great cap on this was Harold Zeman's curation of Venice Biennale in 1999, where 19 Chinese artists were featured, and one of them, Cai Guoqiang, who you typically know as the fireworks guy, won the Golden Lion Prize. Next slide, please. So all of this like really was happening very fast. And one thing that I do continue to appreciate about the Asian contemporary art market as it is expressed. There's so many versions of the Asian contemporary art market, but as expressed by Asian collectors, is that they're not like, it certainly helps. It certainly helps if you can say, oh, that painting was in Venice, or you can say like, that's been collected by the other ones are at MoMA or Getty or whatever. And there was a certain ethos that was like, I'm not waiting for the West or anybody else to tell me this art is good enough. And you can see that in how the prices went up quickly. And Zheng Fanzhi is kind of a great example. In 2008, this became his top price at auction, then it became his top price at auction again 9 years later, and then it became his top price at auction again 2 years later in Beijing. There's a great quote, I always reference this, Liu Yiqian, who's the Shanghai billionaire who he and his wife have been building museums and buying at really high prices. There was a great profile of him where he also buys Chinese furniture, and that there was like I'm going to say a Ming Dynasty throne that the auction house had priced quite low because they weren't sure if it was authentic. And the pricing very quickly was like, 10 or 15 times the low estimate. And he decided to go for it. And he said he knew that the work was right, meaning authentic. And he said, I knew it was right because money's right. And that, that's like a logic here that like, has a lot to do with like how this market developed. One thing that I think is maybe kind of implied by those prices is Chinese contemporary art in particular has lurking in the background of its market and its current pricing as a challenge is like a real supply issue. Like one of the benefits of, Zhao Qi, working with Zhao Qi maybe, is that you have, 7 or 8 decades of material to draw from for a contemporary art market that happened, kind of as quickly as this one did. Maybe you had 2 decades. So in some cases, artist markets can get really stalled out by the fact that like everything is sold. Like everything that could be sold has been sold. And so now what do you do? It's kind of a supply issue in terms of like, how do these values sustain themselves or not over time? Next slide, please. I'm going to try and speed up a little bit. So having witnessed the Chinese phenomena, feeling possibly priced out, feeling not inclined to jump on the bandwagon, we started to see not both, like institutions, and I mean that museums, curators, galleries in the West and the East, and auction houses kind of like, okay, what else? What else have we overlooked? And so that we started to see kind of a reevaluation of like, for example, post-war Japan and the Gutai Art Association, and an interest in like, 1950s, 1960s in particular, works by Chinese abstract painter Shiraga, as well as a woman artist, Atsuko Tanaka on the right. So like more things were kind of flowing in to the market, to the art fairs, to the galleries, as a kind of reevaluation. I think this really isn't limited to the Asian art market. I think it's almost like this kind of supply issue as the global market just gets bigger and bigger. Because you could even see this in like Impressionism. 20 years ago, Impressionism like wasn't maybe all that interested in like Klimt, for example, or Blau Reiter paintings. And there's this kind of like need to continually reevaluate, reassess other areas of the canon of art history in order, I don't know, for lack of a better phrase, to feed the beast. Next slide, please. And so at the same time, you also saw like a growing interest in more of a like post-Korean War phenomenon than like post-World War II, in the monoha and Korean monochrome works that came out, that emerged in that period, which are philosophically really interesting. It was another like abstraction in the West. It was a kind of, it was motivated, I think, in large part by a kind of disgust with what the world had wrought in all the destruction of and death and everything of World War II. And like kind of a turn away from representation into things that were like kind of more philosophical and spiritually informed expressions. And that was the case in these post-Korean War movements, which, aesthetically also just, they simply map really nicely onto American 70s minimalism. And you'll kind of see that over and over again with like maybe shows that like Blum and Poe or others do at this time. I'm sorry, next slide, please. And so all of that is just as like a kind of backdrop to maybe where we are today. And or one aspect of where we are today, at least in the auction. I'll continue to speak about auction for a minute for convenience. Over time, we've seen auction houses in Hong Kong. There was always a lot of pressure to do this, and it's finally really happening in mixing the sales with Western contemporary art and Asian contemporary art. And I think the major auction houses will all say that, like, New York, London, and Hong Kong sale rooms are all more or less on par in terms of the revenue they generate. And that kind of reflects what tends to rise to the top in that world. So, like, not only are you buying, if you're buying Yoshitomo Nara 25 million or almost at any price level, you know, you're buying an artist who has like a great track record in museum collections, museum exhibitions, a history of working with strong galleries, kind of a slow and steady market. I think in the Asian context, it doesn't hurt that it's like kind of cute, it's kind of pop. It has this pop phenomenon outside of fine art in terms of all the collectibles and things that Nara produces. So in essence, you're buying like a semi-liquid asset that's global in nature, and you happen to have bought it in Hong Kong. In the Chinese context, I think Liu Ye is another kind of like hot example. But in the Chinese context, it's kind of relevant because it does feel like slow and steady wins the race in a way, because Liu Ye is sort of the same generation of everyone I referenced earlier. And he kind of always stuck with his galleries. He didn't overproduce. He worked with Tomio in Japan for a time, which was also incidentally Yoshitomo Nara's gallery. He was with Speroni Westwater for a time. Now he's with David Zwirner. It's red. So again, like, because they have this kind of balanced position in these different corners of the art world, not just the market, not just it's worth 20 million because the last one was worth 19, but like curatorial respect, a good, a reliable steward of their career, and David Zwirner, and considered to have integrity and consistency as an artist, that is like a really kind of great position in the Asian art market at this time. Next slide, please. And I think you can kind of see that just as a side note in like what kinds of Western art sell well in Asia. Cause, love them, like them, feel a little ambivalent, is part of like a global phenomenon of pop culture, of irreverent kind of fashion culture, of manga. And yeah, it kind of flows in the same kind of like commodity class. I think probably more so Basquiat, not just as this, well-respected and rightly so artist, also like kind of a figurehead in, what do you want to call it? Kind of like a global phenomenon that transcends auction, which is to say like urban art, street art, fashion. Like so much of it is tied up in the persona of the artist. And, this also lends itself to being a viable vehicle, I guess, in the context of an Asian sale. Next slide, please. And so just to kind of circle back for a minute, this has these shifts and maybe a kind of stabilization of what is considered valuable and how it's valued in the Asian market has been a challenge for artists who were kind of like the darlings of the early part of this history, like Yuan Mingjun, who I happen to like quite a bit. You know, this painting, Guang Guang refers to like how you would describe the sound of a bomb in Chinese, you know, like dogs in Chinese don't say woof, they say yao, and a dropping bomb goes guang. So this is this is a record in 2005. It's a record again in 2008. Next slide, please. And then like a not as fun but very comparable work fails to sell in 2014 and is now estimated for half of what it might have been in 2005. And so, you know, so why is that? Politics play a certain role. There's some idea that like Chinese contemporary art should be political, and that's like a really Western idea. So like Yuan Mingjun in particular might have had very political ideas in his work, in a place where political favor is so important, like China. That doesn't always translate. And I think equally important is that, you know, if Zhang Xiaogang found his way to Pace Gallery, Zheng Fenzhe found his way to Hauser and Wirth, Liu Ye found his way to Zwirner, Yuan Mingjun probably aligned himself with some like quick commercial ideas, but never really aligned himself with like a good steward of his career. And I think it has impacted him overall. Next slide, please. So just to pause for a minute and maybe think, you know, obviously I have no idea who's here and what your background is, but to speak a little bit about this art from an appraisal, so a little bit from an appraisal perspective. I think in our toolkit of being an appraiser, it's in a way it's sort of not rocket science. I do think the wild card is like if a work seems to really specifically relate to a highly regional market in Asia, like how do you get access to that? And so that's really just a question of market segments, understanding if the artist is represented, how and where and what. Asian artists, I don't want to be too stereotypical, but it's a different legacy. The idea of like having a consistent steward of your career is sort of new, and I think artists can be a little bit fast and loose with their relationships and who has what work and when, and that can be a little bit confusing to untangle. And having any kind of access to, like, especially for certain artists, just it depends on the case, to a specialist within an auction house, I think helps quite a bit in terms of getting insight into what goes on behind the curtains and what's really driving the market. Next slide, please. And I guess that's what I mean by that in terms of like all of that, market segments and everything else, is that like just because an artist happens to be ethnically Asian, in this case Chinese, that doesn't mean the Asian market, Asian collectors, Asian values at auction are like the most relevant market segment. You know, Ai Weiwei is kind of a darling of Western curators and collectors precisely for thumbing his nose at the Chinese government. And you can kind of imagine that like collecting public enemy number one is maybe not the number one priority for a collector whose wealth might be in some ways beholden to the Chinese state. Next slide, please. Or for that matter, another artist who, you know, happens to be ethnically Chinese and is well known for his spectacular installations. You know, the fact that his works literally involve exploding gunpowder on paper, despite like his well-deserved recognition in the art world, like that doesn't always translate into a especially buoyant retail replacement value. And I just say all this because fame can really exceed value probably in any market. And it, you know, it just can come to a surprise sometimes to collectors when we're appraising works. Likewise, next slide, Xu Bing, another fantastic artist, MacArthur Genius Award collector, utterly beloved by academics and intellectuals and curators. And again, doesn't always translate into their market value, and sort of unpacking that and what do I want to say? Being kind of clear-eyed about the speculative hangover that this market often has, I think is, for me, a really necessary part of being an appraiser, maybe not in this field, not always like the most beloved part of being an appraiser in this field. Next slide, please. And then you have, you know, then you have artists who work on a case-by-case basis, like a work, you know, this market segment might be New York more than Hong Kong, or vice versa. There was a period of time when you really would have wanted to look at the Asian market segment for a pumpkin or a flower painting of Kusama's, because the things that were like really, really kind of pop were transacted there. That market has deepened and kind of widened enough that it does also include like kind of more connoisseur early pieces as well in the infinity nets. But like I think it's important to like be really clear on like what's local and what's regional, what's global in an artist market. And next slide, please. Just as another example, last but not least, sometimes an artist who happens to have been born in China but lived in the US was best friends with Keith Haring, did these wonderful performance-based photographs in the 70s and 80s. It's, you know, it's really an American market. And it kind of aligns much more with like who collects 80s kind of New York pictures generation Keith Haring stuff than it aligns with the Asian market. And that's the end. Thanks so much, you guys. I see there's something happening in the chat, and so I will pass the baton to Teresa.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. That was fantastic. And you're right, we're already getting questions. Please everyone submit your questions into the Q&A box, and I will ask Ingrid your questions. The first one here, we've seen 2 women artists so far. What can you tell us about women artists from Asia who maybe we're not seeing in the market, or why we're not seeing them?
Why? It's such a big question. I mean, I sort of I remember trying to like convince my boss at the time when I was at Christie's that like Cindy Sherman was like interesting, and he was like, why? And there was like a real way in which like, you know, feminism, representational politics, all that stuff hadn't really and still hasn't quite taken root. It's shifting maybe, but it's kind of a Western import. And there is a way in which I'll speak to China in a way that what happened in China, like in the 90s, really mapped onto like what was going on post-war art in the US. Like there are women, their wives, their dealers, agents, their handmaidens sometimes to these artists, and they're kind of treated as also rans. So I appreciate the question because I think that I could, in another version of this, dig deeper into like showing that and kind of digging into like where those careers have tracked or not and why. I would say that like it's a gender politics like anywhere. It's like it's a very patriarchal, male dominated, sort of culturally monolithic culture that makes it really hard for women to work in.
Thank you. And so this question, we've had a few variations of, a little bit about the typical Chinese collector or buyer. Are they young, old, regional, international? So buyers in the Chinese and Asian market.
It's all really different. I think if I can keep that old auction hat on for a minute, like so much of what happened in this market up till about 2010, 2012, even though the fantasy was about the Chinese collector, it was really about like Taiwan, Hong Kong Chinese, Indonesian Chinese, and like the mainland Chinese phenomenon is maybe more of the last decade. And so those are all really different, like Taiwan, like God bless Taiwan. It's kind of where like all the like intellectuals went after the revolution. And so and they're like fiercely democratic, and like it's like Taiwan is like France, like it's just so like robust aesthetically and sophisticated, and like that taste is what really drove the earliest part of this market in terms of looking at Sanyu and Zhaoqi and those kind of flows to Europe and back to Asia. I think that we are like time changes quickly, right? Like I was part of a generation of like white people who ran galleries in China 20 years ago. They're kind of like 999% all Chinese now. And partially that is because you've had enough generations like educated in the West or in Asia, but there wasn't really like a strong education system for art market professionals. So often they're kind of like imported or they come home. And so then you also have like the younger buyers who grew up with passports, grew up with educations abroad, and they tend to be kind of like more global in mindset, more kind of pop fashion oriented. I think the parts of the market that support cause and support like street art and urban art like really comes from like a younger generation. And then like the like the super rich in China, it's like they're building their own private metropolitan museum for Asia, for China. So it's like at this point, you kind of have everything as you have everything anywhere else, I think. I hope that helps a little.
No, that's fantastic. And the next question here, can you tell us a little bit about authenticity issues in the Asian market? Is there anything that appraisers should be aware of?
I think that in terms of like the art that I spoke of today, like I always feel very safe in the modern and contemporary world because like ink painting to me would be like really easy to fake. Like I would be like lost at sea at that. And so even if we look at like a Yuan Jun or something and think, oh, that looks kind of easy, when I have seen fakes, they're so bad and ugly that it's like not an issue. You can get into like thorny stuff with individual artists. It's like really, really specific. Like for example, in Korea, I think it's like the Korean Dealers Association was the body that certified authenticity for like second half of the 20th century modern works in Korea. And at some point, specific artists didn't want to work with them, so they started calling things fake. So it was kind of more of like a political issue than an actual authenticity issue. So that's where you can kind of get into the weeds a little bit. For the most part, if something's like not right, it's so obvious. So that helps.
Thank you. And it is just past 2 now. So I'm going to ask you one last question that I've seen twice. Do you think young Chinese contemporary artists would have a place in the international market? And so the other variation of that question was, are there any young new artists that you're seeing?
I mean, I think the answer is always yes. I'm sort of grateful that like enough sobriety has entered into the market that like we don't see things, at least at auction. I'll say at auction, you don't see things that were like painted yesterday in the same way. So that maybe people felt they were seeing, 15 years ago. In terms of China in particular, I think the thing that's really interesting about all of this is that now it's really artist by artist, and it's about the integrity of the artist. It's about like who they work with over time. And if the artists we looked at, didn't look Chinese to you, the artists that are like emerging now, even less so, because they're engaged with like new media forms, social media forms that are like beyond my imagination anyway. Like they're just so utterly in a different world that it's not emerging as like a kind of trend in the same way. So for sure, yes, I think. And then to the second part of your question is that, it's seated here in the pandemic, like I just haven't gotten out and about to see what's like really new in such a long time. So I don't have a specific name, honestly, to give you. So I hope that helps a little.
That does. Thank you so much. So we were just out of time now, but Ingrid, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our attendees for logging on as well. I hope that everyone has a fantastic afternoon. And did you have something to add?
I'm sort of glancing at the chat, and please feel free to share my email.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Yes, I will share that with the attendees. And that reminds me, I will be sharing the PowerPoint and the recording as well. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy your afternoon. Thank you, Ingrid. Bye.